I was curious to see how well single-minded Fury held up to other Fury builds. So in this video, I'm comparing 3 different Fury setups using two-handed weapons, one-handed weapons, and daggers to see how each performed. I was not expecting the results I got. To start, I needed to figure out a way to make the test as even as possible, which meant all weapons had to be the same item level with the same secondary stats. In order to make daggers even with other builds, I used a rank 2 waking stats enchant on my chest during the dagger parse to imitate the 120-ish strength I would get from an item level 343 weapon. I removed the enchant for the two-handed and one-handed parses since my main hand weapons would have strength. If I used weapons with strength for my offhands, that would have put daggers at a disadvantage, so I used the intellect version of each weapon type in the offhand so no build would have an advantage. Not allowing strength on at least one weapon would have penalized two-handed weapons more than the other setup, since one of the big advantages to using two-handers is the higher stats. For builds, while using the two-handers, I used the standard recommended Annihilator build since I would need to use Annihilator with single-minded Fury. When I used the one-handed weapons, I switched out Ashen Juggernaut and Massacre since I felt those would have the smallest impact on my DPS, and I put those points into single-minded Fury and Frenzied Flurry. I ran each setup for 8 minutes because that seemed like a good amount of time for the overall DPS to average out, and my rotation priority for these parses was Rampage, Execute, Onslaught, Bloodbath, and then Bloodthirst and Slam as fillers. Let's start with the two-handers. At the 8-minute mark, I had an overall DPS of 33.6k. I'll go over the results for each parse at the end so I can make the comparison between each iteration. Next up was the one-handers. At the 8-minute mark, I had an overall DPS of 35.8k. My last parse was the daggers to see how weapon speed affects the build. At the 8-minute mark, I had an overall DPS of 36.9k. I was fully prepared to do these parses and make a video on the comparison to show how much better two-handers were than single-minded Fury, but I'm not seeing that yet. To help explain these results, let's dive into the details. Going down the charts, Rampage was my top damage dealer each time, making up 23 to 24% of the overall damage. It was a bit higher for the daggers. Even though percentages were about the same, the actual amount of damage Rampage did differed quite a bit. With the two-handers, it did 3.77 million damage, and then almost 4.4 million damage with the daggers. Execute performed much better with the two-handers, making up over 14% of the damage, and about 10% of the damage for one-handers and daggers. Now for the biggest difference between these setups, Annihilator damage. With the daggers, Annihilator did twice the amount of damage than with the two-handers. Because of the way Annihilator works, it would be easy to conclude that it would be much better for faster weapons, but this also means that the daggers would be able to take advantage of slaughtering strikes more often to boost our Rampage damage. On top of that, I would be generating a lot more rage with every hit, giving me 2 rage, which means more Rampage usages. This explains why Rampage made up more of my damage when I was using faster and faster weapons. Speaking of rage generation, there's one last thing I would want to point out. The amount of times that I had to use Slam and normal Bloodthirst as fillers. With the two-handers, rage generation was noticeably slower, and I had to use Bloodthirst and Slam more often. With the daggers, I never used Slammed once, and Bloodthirst was a tiny percentage of my damage. Now let's get into the buffs to see what's happening there. Maintaining Enrage and Frenzy uptime wasn't an issue for any of the setups. The big difference I want to point out in this chart is Slaughtering Strikes. I had almost double the amount of Slaughtering Strike buffs with the daggers than I did with the two-handers. So not only was I able to use Rampage more often with one-handers and daggers because of the rage generation, but those Rampages were stronger because I was building up more stacks of Slaughtering Strikes. For good measure, I re-enchanted my gear and ran each parse again and using dual strength weapons for the two-hander and one-handers. And for the daggers, I used 2 agility daggers since that was my only option. My thinking was that since daggers would have a significant disadvantage without the extra strength, that it would now parse lower than the other 2 setups. I won't go over these parses in detail because the results as far as which abilities made up what percentage of my damage and how many buffs I got for things like Slaughtering Strikes were nearly identical as the previous tests. I just did more overall damage because of the higher attack power and higher DPS offhand. With the two-handers, I came out with 35.2k DPS at the 8-minute mark, which was an increase of 1.6k DPS. With one-handers, I was at 36.3k DPS at 8 minutes, which was an increase of about 500 DPS. I also wanted to test a theory about Slaughtering Strike buffs to Rampage usages, so I ran a parse where I used Rampage only after 2 global cooldowns to give Slaughtering Strikes time to build up. That parse came up with 35k DPS. Bloodbath made up more of my damage, but the loss from less Rampages was too great. So I'll continue with Rampage prioritization. And for the Daggers, with the strength disadvantage, I came up with 37.9k DPS at 8 minutes, which was an increase of 1000 DPS. So now let's see what we can conclude from these tests. First of all, it's important to say that more parses and longer parses would help with the accuracy of the data. I also don't find computer-generated results useful since it can't account for the human factor when parsing. While it's fun to see results from the Dagger setup, using Daggers just isn't realistic. Even though Daggers ended up with higher DPS with these parses, I'll theorize and say that as you obtain higher item level weapons, the amount of attack power you'll be losing from using Daggers without strength on them will get to a point where two-handers and one-handers will outperform them. You can already see how much of an increase the two-handers got over one-handers and Daggers when I was using 2 strength weapons. So if you're wanting to maximize your DPS, which Fury spec should you play? Well, using the two-handers, I ran one more parse using the Ravager build, which outperformed all these Annihilator setups with 40.7k DPS at the 8-minute mark. If you don't care about maximizing your DPS and are just playing your warrior for fun, then play whichever you want. If you have a couple decent one-handers and want to mess around with single-minded Fury for a bit, then go for it. And that's all for this video. I've satisfied a bit of my curiosity with single-minded Fury, but would still like to run more parses with higher level weapons. I recommend you do some parse comparisons yourself if you want to run single-minded Fury and have higher level weapons. If you see something I overlooked with these comparisons, let me know in the comments, since I want everyone to have the most accurate information. If you'd like to see more World of Warcraft content, then don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, take care.